So in the aftermath of this extremely contentious vote on land distribution, Caesar realizes there's really no working with Bibulus, there's no working with the Senate. He begins to operate independently. He demands that all of the senators swear an oath agreeing to uphold the land distribution legislation that's just passed. And this is very much reminiscent of the kinds of things that the activist tribune Saturninus did, so really recalling an interesting example, and Caesar very much setting himself forward as almost an activist tribune rather than a consul, but making very clear that his interests are with cultivating the loyalty of the masses and not trying to work with his fellow senators. He basically ignores the Senate and just takes his legislation directly to the tribal assembly. Again, a legal move, but one that is highly unusual in the Republic. He refunds a third of the bid to the Publicani in Asia Minor. This syndicate of tax collectors had massively overbid. They couldn't pay the bill and had asked for leniency. The Senate had refused to grant it to them. Caesar now does so, and it's again to cultivate loyalties. He finally ratifies Pompey's arrangements in the East, so Pompey now gets what he wanted out of the triumvirate. And then he passes legislation that regulates the conduct of governors in the provinces. And this is an interesting move, given that Caesar himself had been extremely exploitative as a governor in Spain. But now, almost to forestall the kinds of things that he did, he passes legislation that makes it tougher for his peers to plunder the provinces. He's not doing this out of respect for the provincials or because he cares about them, but rather because he's trying to prevent his fellow senators from accumulating the kind of wealth that he did. So it's really a move against the senators and not as a favor to the provincials. In order to solidify the bond with Pompey, he marries his daughter Julia to Pompey. And this was a very traditional way for men to solidify bonds between themselves. So we see among the senatorial aristocracy a tremendous amount of intermarriage, trading of daughters between different powerful families in order to connect those families more closely and to, in effect, create alliances. It's also a way of advertising the alliance now between Caesar and Pompey. He permits Publius Clodius to change his status from patrician to plebeian. Again, a highly unusual request from Clodius, only because Clodius wants to be tribune of the plebs. He wants to cultivate the loyalty of the masses. So again, we see the recognition by somebody of the power of populism. And so this is what Clodius is trying to do. In order to run for tribune of the plebs, he cannot be a patrician. He needs to be a plebeian. So he gives up that patrician status and becomes a plebeian. Caesar does this as a way of getting back at Cicero. So Clodius and Cicero were long-standing enemies, and Cicero had been speaking out against the first triumvirate. So this is basically Caesar's way of telling Cicero who's in charge, and getting back at him through Clodius. And finally, Caesar arranges long-term commands for himself that he will take over at the end of his consular year. So he's given command of 3 provinces: Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. So all in the north, one on the near side of the Alps, the others on the further side of the Alps. He's also given 4 legions instead of 1, and given this command for 5 years instead of just 1. So a long-term command, multiple provinces, multiple legions. All of this highly unusual. But this is what Caesar wanted. He wanted to be consul, and he wanted to arrange a long-term command for himself. So now he's getting what he wants out of this first triumvirate. Clodius, having been made a plebeian, runs for the office of tribune of the plebs and is elected in 58. He immediately sets out to garner the popularity of the plebeians. He makes grain free now. It had been subsidized for some time off and on, but he now says it's completely free. This is going to be a drain on the Roman treasury, not as much as it might have been because it's been greatly enriched by Pompey and also by Caesar, but it's still nonetheless a drain, and as we'll see eventually in the later Republic, becomes an issue where the Republic cannot subsidize the grain any longer. It's a costly endeavor. The population is quite large in Rome. It's difficult to get a steady supply of grain in. So Clodius doing this is an incredible move, and very much speaks to the notion of sort of plebeian culture as bred in circuses. If you want to appeal to the masses, you give them free grain and you put on games. Clodius also removes the ban on clubs, what are called collegia. And the concern about these collegia was that they were being used for political reasons, that people would get together and talk politics and plot. That this was partly responsible for some of the anarchy in Rome, the violent atmosphere that dominates in the 50s. So they had been banned. Clodius removes that ban, much to the delight of the people, some of whom want to be able to now go back to playing games, bathing. These clubs did things other than plot overthrows. So this was another way for Clodius to win over the support of the masses. He also uses his year as tribune of the plebs to exact revenge on Cato. He has Cato assigned to oversee the annexation of Cyprus. And this means now that Cato is out of town. And so he gets rid of this obstructionist conservative senator, sends him off to Cyprus for the year, where Cato's skills will be well used in the annexation. And he arranges for Cicero to be harassed. And with Cicero, what he does is have reaffirmed a law that made it illegal to kill a fellow Roman citizen without a trial. Cicero, unfortunately, had done just that when he had Catiline murdered. And even though Catiline is branded as an enemy of the state, as plotting against Rome, it was still illegal to have him killed without a trial. And so by reaffirming this law, what Clodius is doing is sending a message to Cicero that he intends to prosecute him. Cicero gets this message loud and clear. He looks to his fellow senators for support. He looks to the triumvirs for support, and nobody comes to his defense. And Cicero realizes that the only thing he can do is leave town, and so he goes off into exile, into Macedonia. Clodius, also sort of getting a bit big for his britches, decides that he's going to take on Pompey. And he actually has Pompey attacked in the streets. He has physical violence done to Pompey's body. Pompey is terrified, and the story is that Pompey locks himself in his house for 2 years because he's too afraid to leave. He's too afraid of the sort of gang warfare that's going on in the streets of Rome. And it's a marker of just how unstable, in fact, Rome was at this time. That really there was a lot of political violence, that there were these gangs that were just operating at the whim of the political leaders that were paying them. So Pompey's response to being attacked by Clodius's thugs is to get his own thugs. He has 2 of the tribunes, Milo and Cestius, recruit a gang of thugs. And their sole purpose is to protect Pompey and fight against Clodius's thugs. So what we have here is really a kind of fascinating instance of sort of, on the one hand, a power struggle at the highest levels of Roman government, but also a power struggle happening in the streets of Rome between these gangs that were fighting against one another. And here you have a picture of Cicero in all of his dignified glory. So in 57, we start to see fissures in the alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. In some ways, the first triumvirate has served its purpose, and it's not clear what else it needs to do or can do. And in particular, what starts to emerge are tensions between Pompey and Crassus. So the two of them had been brought together by Caesar for the purpose of this first triumvirate, but Crassus is getting a little bit unsettled. He's feeling like it hasn't really benefited him as much as he would have liked, and Pompey starts to suspect that Crassus is actually aligning himself with Clodius and is partly responsible for the attacks on Pompey. So there are tensions there between the two. It's also at this time that Rome itself is under pressures. Cicero is now back in Rome. He's been recalled from exile with the support of the Senate and with the support of Pompey. And part of the deal was Cicero promised that he would support the first triumvirate. But as soon as he gets back in Rome, he starts talking smack again. And so there's concerns now that Cicero needs to be dealt with, but Cicero is really stirring up a lot of trouble against the first triumvirate, a lot of antagonism. There's a grain shortage. People are hungry. This makes the plebs not very satisfied. So that also is putting pressure on these populist politicians like Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. And then finally, there is a threat to end Caesar's Gallic command. And what Caesar's concerned about is not just that he's not going to have this long-term command anymore, but specifically that it will make him vulnerable to prosecution. As soon as he lays down the command and becomes a private citizen again, now charges can be brought against him by any other Roman. And in fact, it was fairly likely that he would be prosecuted on charges of extortion for his behavior in Spain when he was governor. This wouldn't have been unfair, but it's also true that what Caesar was doing was what everybody was doing. But Caesar recognizes the ways in which these trials are used to prevent the advancement of politicians, and that he would get tied up in law courts for a significant amount of time. So he's also very concerned about retaining that command and therefore retaining his immunity from prosecution. So in April 56, the triumvirs agreed to meet in a town in northern Italy called Lucca. And you can find Lucca on page 150 on the map there. But they agree to meet in this town rather than in Rome because it's as far south as Caesar can come without having to lay down his command. And he cannot lay down his command without becoming then a private citizen and subject to prosecution. So he's only going to go to Lucca, and the other triumvirs have to come to him. Senators are also invited and in fact turn out in large numbers. It's a difficult meeting, there's a lot of discussion, but the end result is that the triumvirs reaffirm their alliance and make plans for the future. They figure out what each of them wants out of this alliance going forward. So for Pompey and Crassus, what they want is a consulship, and it's arranged that they will be elected consuls in the next year, and that after their consulship, they will appoint themselves long-term commands, or the Senate will grant it to them. But it's agreed that the Senate will make those arrangements. It's also agreed that the Senate will, in fact, extend Caesar's term of command in Gaul, so extending his time there, which allows him both to make a reputation as a glorious general, enrich the Roman coffers, but continue to protect him from prosecution. And then finally, it's agreed that they will get Cicero and Clodius in line. These two men who had both benefited in various ways from members of the triumvirate and the support of the triumvirate, but who had been acting against the interests of the triumvirate. They are now going to be brought back into line.